Hello, welcome to the second lesson of the UPM, the Mariam Popular University, and here we are for the new course 2001-2022 with the title The Place Where God is Alone with God, the Conscience. I'm Roberto Bertolassi, Italian. I'm a researcher in the University of Sofia. I work in the world of philosophy, and I greet you from Lopiano, where I am present, right into the heart of the university. The title of today has The Conscience in a Plural World, Different Perspectives. And today, like never before, our series of lessons, we will give the word to four teachers, friends, who will guide us through their own disciplines in the world of conscience. And therefore, I welcome Emanuele Pili, Caterina Belzong, Roberto Almada, and Cecilia. A real international panel to begin, to continue this new cycle of lessons of our university. But before we even begin, let us take a step backwards. We go back to the lesson number one, the one that really started off our course, the one of the 6th of November 21. And Andrew Camilleri was there and started from the spirituality of unity within the Focolare movement, which is very well known to many of our listeners. He led us to see the conscience from the point of view of the Church's magisterium within the Catholic Church, and to see, in particular, in the moral theology. And that really produced quite a few questions. Now, Andrew Camilleri is in the Philippines, and he could not reply to these questions directly, but he asked someone else to do so, to another colleague, another moral theologian, Colomba Kim, and she will then answer the questions that were addressed after Andrew's lesson. Then, after Colomba, we will continue with our course. Some of the questions that have remained open from last time, and they will ask, when will we get our own answers? Well, they might find the answers from what will be said today. So now, without any further ado, I leave the floor to Colomba Kim, and enjoy this session.
Thank you to those who've asked these questions so that we can understand better the meaning of moral conscience. In fact, the whole of the course, UPM course this year, hinges on it. In the Roman Catholic Church and also in common language, we almost always understand a moral conscience. But then we also use conscience to indicate other meanings, as we will see immediately. But this does not happen in other languages or cultures where different words are used for different meanings. From this derives the usefulness of the questions that have been asked. For example, in German, the moral conscience has its own specific word. The word. So here's a brief PowerPoint. The word conscience comes, or consciousness, conscience or consciousness comes from the Latin conscientia, cum scienza, which emphasizes the character of knowledge, that is, the awareness that each person has of the inner reality and of the world outside the ego. We speak of ontological or existential consciousness that gives foundation to the human being as a subject, as a creature to whom life has been given. It allows one to realize one's own existence, which is distinct from that of all other created beings, and to be able to grasp that one is in relationship with God, with others, and with creation. We then speak of psychological conscience, that is expressed in the ability to grasp within oneself one's own experience, what we have lived, and what makes us aware of what we are and what we're doing. That is, it is that knowledge of oneself as an acting subject that accompanies the action. It is I who think, who run, who eat, and so on. Normally, this is expressed by the verb feel, which expresses the unity of thinking and wanting. Precisely, when we say, I feel good or bad, or I like this or I don't like this, we are referring to the psychological conscience. Also emphasized is the value of a social conscience that is not to be understood only as sensitivity to social problems, but above all as the awareness that the person has of their social being, of being a social person. In fact, God's plan for humankind, expressed in Genesis 1:27, is clear. God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. Male and female. Humanity is created in the image of a triune God, a God who is a relationship of love within himself. All these meanings are thus used, but the most commonly used is that deeper dimension. The deeper dimension. It's the capacity that the person has to evaluate. It's the moral conscience in which everyone is called to respond to the call of good or evil. In fact, this moral conscience is often considered as a synonym of the person in his or her spiritual dimension, as a dynamic interweaving of soul, mind, and heart. In the Christian view, it is the place where the encounter with God and with one's neighbour in Christ takes place, an encounter founded on freedom and regulated by the love that directs our action. The moral conscience is the place, location, of the experience of good or evil for every person in the depths of our conscience. The responsible subject dialogues with God, or for non-believers, dialogues with meaning and values. The moral experience always refers to conscience as to the place where it can be seen clearly. As Andrew reminded us in the lesson before the Second Vatican Council, he defines it as follows: conscience is the most secret nucleus and shrine of human beings, where they are alone with God, whose voice resounds in their depths. For this reason, we're called to listen to that voice, as Chiara affirmed. It's necessary to silence everything in us in order to discover his voice. And we must extract this voice, like taking a diamond out of mud, clean it, put it on display, and give it in due time, because it is love, and love must be given. Thank you. Thank you very much, Colomba Kim, for your answers to the questions. She is a moral theologian. So now let's get into today's lesson, conscience in a plural world, different perspectives. Yes, because the perspectives through which we are approaching the subject of conscience today are four. One is a philosophical approach, one through measurable sciences, another is psychological, and then social ethics. I invite all our listeners today to do this exercise, to seek, to extract, to draw out from every talk a key question. What is the question to be answered in this? So we won't have much time for questions. It won't necessarily be possible to answer in a full and complete way to all your questions. But these talks will be a start for our reflection. So draw out a fundamental question to which each talk should respond could be an exercise in which we can look alone or together with others at these talks, because the questions are very important. The answers are very important, the talks are very important, but the questions are very significant. We don't just want answers, we want to know more, we want to go ahead, we want to learn, and that's why questions are very important. So let's start. I will also make a small input about the questions I'm drawing out of these talks and the golden thread running through the talks today. I'm also going to stealing time from Emanuele Pili. He's our first speaker. He's a philosopher. He's going to speak directly from the center of the Focolare movement at Rocco di Papa. He's from Genoa. He has a degree in philosophy from Genoa, and he's also studied at the Sofia University, and he teaches in the University of Genoa. And we're looking at modern history, also at the Sofia University. So we wonder whether Antonio Rosmini spoke about friendship, and then the ontology, and so I do apologize, he's speaking too fast. He's also studied St. Thomas Aquinas. So we have an exceptional speaker here, and he's going to speak about two of the most significant authors in Western thought, Spinoza and Leibniz, talking about freedom. So, Emanuele, we're very happy to have you, and over to you.
Okay, good afternoon to everyone, to those who are linked. Thank you, Tommaso, for your introduction. Thanks to those who even thought of inviting me. Certainly, philosophy is a science that is based on questions and ends up in more questions. So it's probably going to conclude itself with more questions. However, this helps us to enter into this discipline that has this peculiarity. It constantly asks itself, what is it itself? It's kind of an operation that is it's very much at the basis, and it's right to begin from there. It's good to start off from philosophy, that is, from those who think of questions and develop and try to come up with some answers. So the goal that we set ourselves with this brief talk is to introduce some of the main questions related to conscience. Conscience is a place of interiority and of choices in our life. The approach that I propose to you in the context of a discipline such as philosophy is of historical theoretical type. There are many ways of approaching it. But what does historical theoretical mean? It means that taking care of wisdom and the profound purpose of philosophia already contained its name, well, this taking care of wisdom cannot be conducted without dialoguing with great honesty and respect with those who before us have already asked themselves their own questions. That is why for philosophy, history is important. It would be kind of presumptuous to face any philosophical problem by pretending that there was no one else before me who had the same desire as I have, who did not struggle with the same problems I struggle. On the other hand, however, theory is also important because while respecting the context and the specific reality in which the other who is also distant from me in time, so while respecting those who are with those, I too, in turn, are influenced by my historical situation, and I interact, and in the end, generate an alternative understanding of philosophical questions. Because philosophy is always the same, but also change. But this takes place precisely in dialogue. And this is true also of each one of us, to the point of saying that amongst ourselves, tell me who you dialogue with and I will tell you who you are. Today's questions around conscience and its moral choices have deeply disturbed and animated many thinkers, of course. We're not alone in this search. The whole history of philosophy could be read as an attempt to answer these questions. Hence, my fundamental difficulty of mine, because I kind of have to force myself to narrow the field. But I've chosen to focus on a precise historical moment and on two particular authors, and only then on some main ideas of their thought. We cannot handle everything, otherwise it would become something too general and has little impact. I therefore refer to the context of the second half of the 17th century up to the early 18th century. And I'm taking as point of reference those authors that were mentioned before, Baruch Spinoza and Gottfried Leibniz, as thinkers and dwelling in particular on their reflection on freedom. I think there are two fundamental authors to understand modernity and even current events. There are thoughts who say that talking about reality of the world must always start from logic, rationality, from reasoning. Therefore, we will try to have a tiny dialogue on a precise topic that is freedom. But why talk about freedom? We were talking about conscience earlier, so we can ask ourselves, what's freedom got to do with it? Actually, it's easy to answer this. In order for conscience to deliberate for good or evil, for me to choose, I must assume that I have the possibility of choosing freely for one or the other, otherwise there would be no choice. The question of what it means to act consciously then refers us to the question, and these philosophers help us to change, modify the questions. Are we really free to choose? What does it mean to be free? So these philosophers help us, first of all, to think more deeply about our own questions. Can we truly act freely? Do we have that freedom? So, let's see what, very quickly, what these two philosophers have to say to us. The first one, Spinoza. Spinoza describes human freedom with an incisive and challenging image. In fact, it really challenges us. He compares the human being to a stone that once thrown or simply set in motion believes that it can independently decide its trajectory and choose the where and when it will fall. This stone, Spinoza says, believes that it is very free and that it does not persevere in motion for any other cause than its own will. This is the type of human freedom which all boast of having, and which consists only in being people aware of their appetite and unaware of the causes by which those are determined. So, as you see, from this statement of Spinoza, the philosopher believes that each of us is inserted in a horizon of rigorous necessity. While trying to show in what sense freedom can exist, the leitmotif of Spinozian reflection moves in the idea that free will, the possibility of choice, is a mere sheer illusion. Then he will talk about freedom in other ways, but it doesn't matter. At this point, we just focus on this. Where does this vision of freedom come from? If we do have freedom, it coincides with necessity. To understand this, it is enough to think that Spinoza believes that only those who are autonomous and independent are free. That is, they don't depend on anyone. That is, those who are fully in and of themselves, those who possess themselves completely. Being in oneself and conceiving oneself only for oneself is what Spinoza calls substance. Substance which therefore comes to be the only reality that can aspire to freedom. Well, at this point then, we might ask ourselves, who is absolutely in and of him or herself? Let's try to apply that to ourselves, human being. What does it mean to be someone who is absolutely substance, that is autonomous and not dependent on anything else? Let's try to think above all of the human being, since our theme is conscience. What about is absolutely ours without depending on anything else? Maybe our ideas? Certainly not, because they come from something else. Maybe our training? Certainly not, because it comes from something else. Often we find that they are the desires of others, maybe of faith or convictions. No, they come from others too. Maybe our desires, they are the others. So in short, the more we question every characteristic that we consider to be peculiar to us, the more we are sent back to something else, which reveals our not being in and of ourselves. And the point is that being free means being independent. Spinoza reiterates that is not dependent on anything else. Thus, the philosopher concludes freedom appears as an illusion, or at most can be thought of as a certain expression of necessity. Since every time our conscience returns to itself, it does not find, but it will find others on whom it depends, our conscience by which it is shaped. What then? What is substance? Only that which does not depend on anything else. But what does not depend on anything else? Come to think of it, only all. Rather, the totality of such, just the totality as such is substance. Because only the whole doesn't need anything else to be itself. This is Spinoza. Now, let's see Leibniz, how he turns around the same question. Leibniz, in a sense, presents us with a vision of reality that is reversed compared to that of Spinoza. He wishes to save at all costs the possibility of freedom, and perceives that this possibility is preserved if the conception of the substance is changed. Leibniz, therefore, first of all points out that the events that happen in us and around us, called factual truths, are not subject to a rigorous necessary logic, but follow a principle called the principle of sufficient reason, by which the event itself is inclined towards a certain end, without, however, being necessitated by it. The event is not necessitated, it's just inclined towards it. To explain what the philosopher wants to tell us, let's take an example. When we are in front of a supermarket shelf, the arrangement of products on the shelf, which, by the way, is never random, influences our choice in one way or another, without, however, making us need it. Leibniz wants to tell us that the subject who performs the action will certainly be located in a context, but the latter can only incline towards a choice, that is, without actually needing it. The fact that a subject is inclined towards something without it being necessary suggests that the subject acts in and of itself, and that therefore it is, in Spinozian terms, the substance of Leibniz. For Leibniz, therefore, the substance is the individual subject and not the totality as in Spinoza. If in Spinoza there is only one eternal universe, with its ways and attributes, expressions of the one substance, the world of Leibniz is made up of an infinity of substance, called monads. This is what he called them. In some way, these monads are masters of themselves and their destiny, since they are not necessarily determined by the context. Monad is an interesting term, because it comes from monos, which means unique, simple, but it also means alone. What characteristics do these substances have, then, to claim to be free? Leibniz, among other things, dwells on a property that particularly interests us. In order for them to be free, in fact, these monads cannot influence each other. Otherwise, they would stop being free. They are certainly placed in a harmonious context, like in a... I'll read you this passage of... There is no other way of... there is means to explain how monad can be altered or modified in its interiority by some other creature, since there is nothing to take away in it, not being able to imagine it in any internal movement that can be aroused. Monads have no windows through which something can enter or exit. In short, Leibniz saves the possibility of free will, but the price to pay is the idea of an individuality that relates to others only superficially, ideally, and not really, because this would make freedom itself impossible. So, let's conclude with some ideas. Recapitulating in 2 words. Spinoza, on the one hand, presents us with a universe that is only a relationship, and that precisely for this reason excludes human freedom, cataloging it as a mere illusion. Leibniz, on the other hand, saves the possibility of freedom, but precisely because he excluded the possibility of a relationship and a real encounter between subjects. On the surface, the way the two see things appear opposite, and yet there is a common trait that we must highlight. They both agree, in fact, in thinking that an authentic experience of freedom excludes the dynamics of the relationship. According to Spinoza and Leibniz, despite the difference of the reference systems, being free implies not being in relation. The two terms are mutually exclusive. I told you at the beginning that these philosophers have influenced modern culture enormously, to the point of arriving like a river that erodes its way to our day. Let's think about it. After all, at least instinctively, each one of us today understands very well that to be free, they must be disconnected from others. Indeed, the adventure of the world in which we live, especially the one most influenced by the West, could be read in this key. Where there is a bond, we tend to believe that freedom is suffocated. And so in the name of freedom, we tend to want to loosen many fundamental relational experiences. Just think of pregnancy, marriage, couple relationships and engagements, communities, friendships, but even at other levels, global, the parties, the political, being together encounter between cultures and between religious faiths, up to the relationship with one's body and one's sex. I must be able to auto-determine this, and I have to do this independently. This is what we are thinking today very much. But the basic theoretical knot, which is common to our somewhat sclerotic time, is given by thinking about freedom in conflict with relationship. But let's try to think even deeper then. And in conclusion, ask yourselves, when have we had the experience of feeling fully fulfilled and therefore free? Free to make mistakes or to do well, free to make any decision. On close inspection, I believe that each one of us has had the experience of freedom precisely when it was united with a certain bond, linked to that, which is the bond of mutual promotion and mutual recognition. A bond that is of love, where each one is so that the other can be truly. In this experience, and this is fundamental, we see that it is the bond itself as a third in the relationship and which transcends both, something that has the feel of a person. It frees us from ourselves, from our conditioning, and from the other as well. In some way, Spinoza and Leibniz were also right in this. Ultimately, are we sure that freedom, we then discover that freedom is the gift given by a third subject, which is the reciprocity of love itself. Ultimately, are we sure that freedom conflicts with the relationship? There is certainly a form of relationship that suffocates the singularity. Think of Spinoza. But are we sure that freedom should not be thought of precisely from where it is experienced, that is, from the relationship of love? Isn't freedom actually expressing oneself in the place where my irreducible singularity, my substantiality, is expressed precisely in being in mutual relationship with and for the other? Thank you for being with me. Thank you, Emanuele Pili, for this very profound and beautiful talk on freedom, which brings us to one of the fundamental realities of conscience. I can choose what is good and what is evil if I'm free to choose it, and then to carry on this choice. Emanuele has led us to the heart of the problem, that is the problem of relationship. If I am in a relationship with other, am I free or not? And showed us through Spinoza and Leibniz, two very important philosophers, that the problem is not as simple as it might seem, and that freedom is strictly linked with rationality, and that is not to be taken for granted. And at the end, it suggested that the theme of love is what resolves the relationship between freedom and report. But if these two authors belong precisely to the 17th, 18th century, in the 20th century, that is in 1900, in the history of the Western thought, in philosophy, there is another great protagonist, that's the body, the corporeity. And the body brings with itself a whole series of problems that have to do with our relationship with the other, with ourselves, and with conscience itself. In the 1900s, in the 20th century, the empirical sciences really have a great expansion, and they affirm something according to the reality, observing it, putting together some data. Now we know how complex the observation of data is. We are full of experts that keep on observe. They tell us something of the data that they gather, and others, and there are some that don't believe in it, and we don't understand very much. This is on to introduce the next talk, that is something that is of scientific, empirical nature, with Catherine Belzong. Who Catherine Belzong is? An eminent person in the international scientific world. She is a scientist, a professor in the University François Rabelais de Tours in France. In 1998, becomes a doctor in the Pasteur University of Strasbourg, and then has followed the postdoctorate doctorate in Rome, and now is an assistant of the François Rabelais University. And from 2002, she is ordinary professor for master condition in neuroscience of the University of François Rabelais in Tours. And she's also a member of the scientific group of that university, and is part of the national group of scientists in the whole nation. Also a consultative member of the European College of Neuropsychopharmacology. And from the 11th of December 2012, because of her scientific merit, she has been placed in the Legion of Honor, which is the highest honor in the French Republic. This is just to tell you the weight of this person who is now going to introduce us in the world of the neurosciences and in the world is about conscience from this very perspective. Catherine, to you.
Il microfono, Catherine? Eccoci.
Sì.
Thank you very much for this introduction, for the opportunity I have been given to speak to you also from the point of view of a biologist. Hello to everyone. I am a biologist in the field of neuroscience, and in the field of neuroscience, we do not use concepts such as moral conscience or hearing the voice within us or listening to the Holy Spirit, which are instead in the field of spirituality or morality or philosophy. We have a more neutral vocabulary, one that is more descriptive. And then, to reflect, we use the experimental method. And we also rely on real cases, such as cases of people who have brain disorders. However, even if we use a different method than the one used by philosophy or by psychology, we also talk about a process that guides us towards a good decision, towards the right decision. And there is much research done on how we make a decision. It often happens that we are faced with choices, that we find ourselves at a crossroads that allows us to go both to the right and to the left. We can choose good or bad. So the question we can ask ourselves is, are we free to make our own choices? Do we have free will? Or are we manipulated by our biology Are we doomed by our genes from birth? Are we puppets of our brains? Some stories seem to go in this very direction. Here is one among many others. I've chosen it because it seems to me to be emblematic of the current of thought that denies free will. We're in July 2010, in Arizona. John McCulsey escapes from the prison he's in. With his girlfriend, he steals the car of a retired couple who were having a quiet holiday there. He kills the couple, burns their car with their bodies inside, and goes away. A few days later, he was arrested and then summoned to court for the 2 murders. But the court had a difficulty agreeing on the sentence. Why was that? The defense had submitted images of John McCulsey's brain to the court. The defense said that small lesions had been highlighted, which represented the explanation for his acts, his behavior. He was not responsible. The culprit was his brain. John, therefore, would not have been free, wasn't free to act as he had really done. He would not have been able to choose whether to kill or not to kill, whether to do good or do evil. It was only his brain that had made the decision, and as a result, he could not be held responsible. And there are hundreds of stories like this. Other people incriminate genetic material using the same reasoning. The culprit is the genetic material of the murderer, and not the person as such. At this point, we might ask, does science actually say that? Has neuroscience shown that we're not free? That isn't what the truth is. There are some neuroimaging discoveries, or based on images of the brain, that have often been interpreted very badly. Let's start with the results of MRI, magnetic resonance experiments. These experiments consist in observing what is happening in the brain while a decision is being made, and through them it's been seen that there are areas of the brain that are activated during the decision-making process. When we are weighing up within ourselves the consequences of choosing option A or option B. And these regions of the brain are located beneath your forehead. Other regions, on the other hand, are activated when you take action, when you actually decide. But this doesn't mean that we are the puppets of the activation of these parts of the brain, because we are the ones who choose whether to activate these brain processes or not. These experiments don't prove that it is brain activation that causes the decision. They only show that the activation of specific brain regions occurs at the same time as the decision. Another experiment that sparked much debate is that of the American neurophysiologist Benjamin Libet in 1983. So what was that all about? Libet did an electroencephalography of a subject sitting in front of a table, while this subject was looking at a very, very precise type of clock. On the table, there was a button that this person, the subject, could decide to activate with his hand. The scientists had asked this person, the subject, to memorize the time shown on the clock at the very instant he made the decision to put his hand on the button. And then they, the scientists, would look at the exact moment when he actually put his hand on the button. So what did they observe? They observed that the subject had made the decision to push the button 200 milliseconds before the action itself, which consisted of moving his finger. In addition, however, they also noticed something even more surprising. In fact, 500 milliseconds before the decision, they saw a brain signal, a wave, which they called Readiness Potential. Benjamin Libet's interpretation of this phenomenon is that the brain, through this wave, is able to make the decision before the subject takes it, because the potential for readiness is activated before the subject consciously decides to move his finger. Libet ultimately proposes that 1. The readiness potential generated by the brain causes 2. The decision, which causes 3. The movement. Therefore, according to Libet, it's not the subject who decides, but his brain. It seems then that there is no hope, because according to this interpretation, we are not free people, because our brain decides for us. We'll see now, however, that more recent experiments have shown the very opposite, that these interpretations are wrong, and that there are arguments in favor of another causal sequence. And this sequence would be 1. I make the decision. 2. This generates something in the brain. 3. That causes the action. This interpretation was put forward by John Dylan Haynes, who did a very elegant experiment in 2015. So what did John Dylan Haynes do? In his experiment, there were 2 buttons, a green one and a red one, which the subjects involved in the study could work with their foot. As in the previous experiment, there was also a signal. There were some letters on a screen that the subjects could use to indicate when they would decide to put their foot on the green or the red button. While they were doing the experiment, brain activity was also recorded using MRI imaging. So they too identified a very early brain signal that indicated readiness to act. At a certain point, however, they asked the subjects to change the planned action. That is, to those who had decided to put their foot on the green switch, they asked them to change their decision and put it on the red one, and vice versa. So what did they observe? They saw that while the signal of readiness potential had already started, so while the signal was already going, the brain had set off, the subject was able to interrupt it to make another decision, a different decision. That is, there is a fairly long period during which the subject can stop this action can disrupt, as it were, the potential for readiness, can inhibit this process in the brain. So, this shows that it's not the brain that decides, but the subject, the person. We are not determined by our biology. Our life is in our hands. Only in the case that an action has already begun, it becomes too late to stop it. And this is also seen in concrete cases. To explain it, I'll tell you another story, that of James Fallon. So what's this one about? James Fallon is a neuroscientist. He works in the field of psychopathy, the pathology that causes some people to make others suffer without feeling any empathy. Since James Fallon is a neuroscientist, he studies the brains of these people. He compares the brains of people with psychopathy with that of normal people, using neuroimaging techniques. In particular, he does magnetic resonance imaging on people in these groups, two groups. Through this method, he discovered very clear signs in the people with psychopathy, a much lower than normal brain activity in the areas below the forehead, which are called prefrontals. He reproduced the result several times in his experiments, and therefore it's a very sound result. One day, while doing a new experiment, a subject in the control group couldn't make it to the appointment to do the resonance. It wasn't possible to miss the appointment for the resonance. So James Fallon thought to himself, but I can replace this person in the control group because I'm normal. And so he offered to undergo the resonance imaging. He did it, and then he waited to see the images of his own brain. And at that point, he got a total surprise. He saw that he has the brain of a person who is a psychopath. Of course, James was massively shocked. He made all the necessary checks, but the result was confirmed. Even if he is a person who behaves normally, he has the brain of a person who has had this psychopath. He reflected very much on this and also wrote a book in which he asked himself, how come I managed to behave in a normal way despite these limitations originating in my brain? And his answer is very clear. He believes that the explanation is to be found in the love that his parents gave him when he was a child. This love had provided him with the resources to address even the biological limitations coming from the dysfunction of his brain. This shows that, despite the structure of our brain that could lead us to do actions that are far from charitable, it is possible for us to act differently. We can say no. We can love, even if everything would lead us to do the opposite, as in the previous experiment. All this has been for many people the subject of much theory in recent books, such as one by Bernard Feltz and Markus Missal, which talks about the theme of free will and neuroscience, published last year, in 2020. And this text is open access and is available for free. Then there's also the Oxford Handbook of Free Will, which is more general, because it doesn't only talk about neuroscience. To sum up, I think it is fair to say that scientific experiments must be interpreted very carefully when data have consequences in other fields of knowledge, such as philosophy. Only an interdisciplinary dialogue based precisely on mutual listening and shared work can make it possible to avoid falling into false and reductionist interpretations. In any case, it can be said that even neuroscience, in the most recent discoveries, has shown that human beings are not the puppets of their brains, but are always able to decide freely. And this reasoning also applies to genetic determinants. That is, everything that is determined by our genome. In any case, the love that we have received builds us up in such a way as to allow us to face even our biological limits, making us be people who are free to decide. Thank you.
Ecco, grazie Catherine Belzong per questo interessantissimo intervento.
Thank you for this very interesting talk. Through an empirical science, typical of sciences, has led us to travel in the world of the brain and ask you a rather provocatory question. Am I deciding or is it my brain? And to give a final answer, it is I who decides. But it is a complex answer because you've shown us that conscience has to do with an ecosystem which is very complex, and biology is a very important part. Therefore, through some experiences, through some practical situations, you've led us to a very focal point in our journey to the understanding of conscience. That is relationships. Again, with very meaningful people in our life. We started off from a question which was rather theoretical, philosophical as to what is freedom. We asked ourselves if freedom depends only on our biology or not, and both cases have shown us how relevant it is to the relationships we create, how fundamental a rapport with the other, and not any rapport, but a rapport of love. So this is what is really the background and the golden thread that links the two talks together. Right. Before we continue with the next two talks, as usual, we will leave some room at the end of the talks for questions. I imagine that already from Emanuele Pili, what he said, and that of Catherine Belzong, you must have some questions you want to place, you ask, and well, you can do it using this telephone number, WhatsApp, or else if you want to send an email, this is where you can send your questions. I'll read them out. 0039 in Italy, that is in Italy, 392 276 439 41. Whereas the email address where you can write is upm@focolare.org. And after these first two very profound talks, but also even demanding for someone who's not really used to this kind of talk, we really need a pause, a break to relax a little before we continue with the talks of Cecilia and Roberto. And they will have more a psychological bent. But before we leave for the break, we'll show you a short video, and then we will meet again at 5:20, if that's confirmed.
So welcome everyone and greetings from Melbourne, Australia.
Vi do il benvenuto.
Proprio dal punto di vista sociologico, la materia che appunto insegno.
Cioè, se noi oggi
con i beni comuni non riusciamo a inventarci delle forme che noi possiamo usare i beni comuni senza esserne padroni, quindi senza mangiarli, noi finiamo per distruggere il pianeta.
Qual è il concetto chiave dell'enciclica Laudato Si'? È l'ecologia integrale.
Maria non è stata costretta
Mary was not forced to adhere to the plan of God on her. The church is made, like in all relationships, of a divine part and of a human part. Do you believe that Jesus is risen? Answer for yourself to this question. And it is there, precisely at that moment of resurrection, that this is born, this book, the Gospel, the New Testament.
Ed ecco, questo era lo
So,
spot della
this was the
piattaforma
spot for e-learning of the UPM with a general introduction
alla fede.
to
E
faith,
potete iscrivervi
and you
consultando
can
il sito
enroll
dell'UPM,
if you
e
check
ancora
the
vi ricordo che potete
university
inviarci le vostre
site.
domande
Again, I remind you, you can send us your
all'indirizzo
questions
di posta elettronica
to
e al
the
numero di
email and to
WhatsApp.
that
E
WhatsApp
allora,
number.
buon
And therefore, have
intervallo,
a
ci
good break.
rivediamo
We'll meet
fra
again
30 minuti
in 30 minutes' time
con lo stream.
here through streaming.
intervallo.
Have a good break.
Eccoci,
Here we are
bentornate e
back
bentornati in
again
diretta con la
on our
nostra
live
seconda
broadcast
lezione
of
per
the
il
second
UPM,
lesson
l'Università
of
Popolare
the
Mariana del Movimento
Popular
dei
Marian
Focolari,
University of the
che per il
Focolare
corso
movement for the
2021-2022 prevede
2021-22 course,
lezioni che
which
stanno sotto il
has
titolo Solo
lessons
l'uomo e solo con Dio,
on
la
the
coscienza.
title
E nella
where
seconda
people are alone
lezione,
with
quella
God,
di oggi,
conscience, our
abbiamo
second
4
lesson.
esperti da tutto il mondo:
Lessons
Catherine
today, we have
Belzong
4
e Emanuele
speakers,
Pilli, che
very
hanno
highly
parlato nella
qualified
prima
people,
parte di
Catherine
questa nostra
Belzong and Emanuele
lezione,
Pilli, who've
ed
already
ora
spoken,
Roberto Almada
and
e
now
Cecilia Di
Roberto
Lassio dal
Almada
sud
and
del
Cecilia
mondo.
Di Lassio from the
Prima
south of the
di
world.
introdurli
Before
e prima di lasciare
introducing
loro
them,
la
before
parola,
handing over to
avete
them,
visto prima della
you
pausa
will
un
have
breve
seen a
spot
short spot,
pubblicitario
publicity
sulla
spot,
piattaforma e-learning
about the
dell'UPM, cioè
e-learning platform of
entrando
the
nel sito
UPM. When you go into the site of Università Popolare
c'è uno
Mariana
spazio dedicato
org,
soprattutto ai
there's a
giovani che si
place
chiama
dedicated
UPM
above all to
2.0
young
e-learning,
people,
cioè apprendimento
e-learning,
digitale.
digital
E
learning.
cliccando lì
Clicking
potete
there, you
iscrivervi
can
in modo virtuale
sign
e ad avere
up
accesso a vari
virtually to
corsi
have access on
sulla fede, sullo
courses
studiare la
on
fede,
essential
sul rapporto
matters
tra
of
me, gli
faith,
altri e Dio,
on the
sulle
relationship between
riflessioni
me,
nella vita sociale,
others,
quindi su
and
come
God,
agire, e poi
life
su
in
come essere
society,
Chiesa
behaviors, and how
comunione
to be
anche con
church
altri.
as
Ecco,
communion
sono
together with
lezioni fatte
others.
da degli
These are
esperti
lessons given by
di
highly qualified people
vari ambiti
in
e vale la
various
pena per
spheres, and
tutti
it's
i
very
giovani che sono in ascolto
worthwhile
o
for all
quelli
the
che
young
conoscete
people who are
poter
connected, or the
mettere il
people you
naso
know,
in questa
to
bella iniziativa
have a look here and
dell'UPM, a cui vanno
follow up this
fatti i
initiative
complimenti in
of the
fondo per lo
UPM,
sforzo di mettere in
because it's
piedi un'iniziativa del
worthwhile
genere.
setting it up and it's
Ecco,
worthwhile following
continuiamo il
it.
nostro
So let's carry
itinerario
on our
in
journey, so
questa
to speak,
lezione,
with the
ringraziando
coming
intanto
up
per le molte
upcoming
domande
lesson. Thank you for the
che
many
continuano
questions
ad
that are
arrivare
pouring
e che sono
in,
state suscitate dagli
that were
interventi
brought
di Catherine
about
Belzong e di
by
Emanuele Pilli,
the
e
talks
continuiamo
we
senza
heard
dubbio
earlier.
stimolando in voi ancora
And we'll
molte
go
domande
on now, and we'll
e lasciando
certainly
la parola a
generate
Roberto
many
Almada. Chi è
more
Roberto
questions
Almada?
by hearing
Vita
Roberto
argentina,
Almada. He's an
argentino, medico, psichiatra e
Italian,
psicoterapeuta della scuola di
Argentina. He's a
logoterapia di Viktor
doctor
Frankl.
and a
Ha una
psychotherapist in
licenza in
Viktor
filosofia,
Frankl's field.
bachillerato in
He also has
teologia.
a
E ha una
degree in
lunga esperienza come
philosophy, in theology.
psicoterapeuta
As a
nella formazione permanente di membri di
psychotherapist,
istituzioni
he has
ecclesiali.
been working
È
for
stato presidente e
many
fondatore delle società di
years.
logoterapia dell'Uruguay e del Paraguay e
He
si
has done
interessa
much
in
work in
particolare degli
Uruguay
spazi
and
teorici
Paraguay,
di frontiera tra
much work
psicologia,
on
psichiatria,
theory in
filosofia e
psychology,
spiritualità.
psychiatry,
Vi segnalo anche un
philosophy,
suo
and
libro di qualche anno
spirituality. I'd
fa
like
in
to mention
spagnolo
a
intitolato
book
Ciudad Nueva, Il
of
cansancio de lo
his
bueno, che è stato tradotto in
in Spanish,
italiano
which has been
da un
translated into
editrice
Italian,
piemontese con il titolo Il burnout del buon
The
samaritano.
Burnout of the Good Samaritan, translated
Vi
into
consiglio
Italian.
appunto di leggere
So
questi
if you
libri, così
can
imparerete a conoscere
read these
un po' di più
books,
Viktor
you'd get to
Frankl,
know
ma
more
anche
about Viktor
cosa
Frankl
succede quando si sceglie
and
sempre
what
o si crede di scegliere sempre per il
happens
bene, ma a un
when
certo
you try
punto
to
ci si
choose
stanca e si
always
dice basta, io
for
voglio.
the good,
Ecco,
but then at a certain
io
point you
cedo la
stop and say,
parola
I'm
a
giving
Roberto
up.
Almada, ci porterà
So
tutti in questo
Roberto
viaggio
will lead
nel
us
campo
into this
della psicologia
journey
e in un
of
confronto tra
through
l'analisi
psychology and a
esistenziale che è la
comparison
propria della
between
logoterapia di Viktor
existential
Frankl e la
analysis
psicanalisi
and
più ortodossa, quella che viene
psychoanalysis, more
dalla radice di
orthodox
Freud, e quindi
Freudian
con
psychoanalysis,
il suo grande termine,
and
l'inconscio.
this term of the
Ecco appunto,
unconscious.
allora vedremo come la
So we'll see
coscienza
how
sia legata
conscience
non
is
solo
linked not
all'etica,
only
alla
to
scelta, ma
ethics,
anche a
to choices, but
qualcos'altro.
also to
Ecco
something
allora,
else. So,
Roberto, a te la
okay, over
parola.
to you, Roberto.
Certainly, the debate, which the others have explained so well, on freedom, conscience, and determinism, is a debate that has also entered psychoanalysis. And with this form of seeing the human person, of helping the human person, it began between the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. In this session, we will look to and be inspired above all by a system of existential analysis of the human person derived from the thought of Viktor Frankl, an Austrian Jew who was a prisoner in concentration camps. He was from Vienna, an Austrian, as I said, and he is the founder of the school of the current of existential analysis called Logotherapy. Logotherapy also arises from the human person's sense of responsibility, because its center is the idea of the human person, who is looking to give meaning to their life, to its own life. Life offers a meaning and the person responds. This response is what we can call responsibility. And therefore, it is a free response that contrasts with the automatism of the psychic apparatus, with an autonomy of the human person. And to lay foundations for this autonomy of the human person, Viktor Frankl refers to a profound dimension of human beings, which is the spiritual dimension. It is a change of perspective, motivated by the need of each individual to recognize the meaning of their own existence. Every answer to this question refers to a sense of responsibility, and responsibility refers to the here and now. If the psychoanalysis founded by Freud tries to bring out and give meaning to emotions and existential analysis, logotherapy tries to bring out spirituality, understood as being responsible. The human person understood as being responsible. Therefore, Frankl affirms that there is a spiritual unconscious compared to the idea of the unconscious that prevailed in Freud's psychoanalysis. Freud sees psychism, the psychic apparatus of the human person, as an iceberg. It means that there are conscious parts and unconscious parts. And in this psychism, there are different topics, as Freud calls them. Let's say different spaces, different parts, which have a conscious element and an unconscious element. These three parts are, and you know them, it is very famous, this distinction, the ego, superego, which would be all the cultural component also concerning the duty of the human person, and there is the function that is generally sexual, aggressive, as Freud thinks, which he calls the ES, or id. These three elements form part of the psychism, psychic apparatus, which is a kind of a self-absorbed psychism. We will see how later. This means that there are parts that live within the psychism. Logotherapy, as we said, aims to bring out a sphere that is spiritual and therefore is not self-referential but transcendent. In order to understand clearly where the spiritual begins, it is necessary to draw a demarcation line between the functional being, which means being obliged by nature, by culture, although I'm not saying determined, but very conditioned by this, and the free being, which is the spiritual being. It is not possible to draw a clear boundary between the functional sphere and the spiritual sphere. And it is also difficult to draw a clear boundary between the unconscious and the conscious. But in any case, the human person begins life where the human person has self-mastery. The more self-mastery they have, the more human they are. The more spiritual and free they are, the more conscience they have. An intrinsic aspect, then, to the spiritual being of the human person is conscience. Conscience is in the space of the human person's spiritual being. It is not material. Conscience emerges even from the unconscious. It is not known insofar as the decisions that conscience makes are never completely rational. Conscience is pre-logical, one could say. It is pre-moral. However, its movement, its visions, what the conscience understands, are subject to a critical revision. So, after carrying out an action, we make an examination of conscience, for instance. The examination of conscience is not during the dynamic in which the conscience sees the act, but it is after it has done everything. So conscience, in this sense, is unconscious. The human manifestation is visible, but conscience in itself is unconscious. We are aware that it manifests itself in understanding the real, although conscience does not see real. It sees what does not yet exist. The intuitive, irrational conscience sees the good of an act that has not yet been carried out. Franco says that in this spiritual space where conscience is found, love is also found, and analogically has the same characteristics. It means seeing what is not yet seen. Love sees the power to be of the being that is loved, while the conscience sees what an action should be. Both conscience and love go towards absolute individuality, towards that unique, unrepeatable being that the human person is. And this is something that instinctive impulse does not do. The task of conscience and love is to bring out the absolutely unique reality of that individual. Because love recognizes the unique, unrepeatable being of the beloved. The ethical moral conscience recognizes that one possibility of good which can be achieved by that individual and in those circumstances. A third aspect that lives in that free, pre-logical, pre-moral, spiritual environment is artistic creativity. For Franco, even the artist can intuitively understand what is not yet visible in a piece of marble or in sound. In the sound, he can find music. The artist is also intuitive. Therefore, love, ethical conscience, and artistic creativity are analogous in that they are spiritual, that they can predict what is not yet seen. Therefore, the purpose of accompanying the existence of the other, whether in a spiritual or psychological way, changes. Because now it is not only important to set conscience of self as the ultimate goal of accompaniment, it is also to be aware of one's own conscience. The spiritual being with the ethical conscience can become conscious for a stretch of the road, perhaps in the accompaniment, perhaps through, as we said, the analysis of the a posteriori conscience. For Franco, one should return right away to the unconscious. It seems very important that love has this unconscious aspect, that ethical conscience has this unconscious aspect, and that artistic creativity has this unconscious aspect. Because, and here it is very important to understand it, because I do not go to analyze feelings as if they were a nation state. I do not go to analyze the joy of the other when I'm in front of them. I can only see the intentionality of that joy. The joy for me is for having found you, for having found meaning, for having found love. This is fundamental. In this context, we have also referred to the transcendence of conscience. One can only understand the freedom of conscience if we see it as transcendent, which has an intentionality which makes it come out of itself. Therefore, as the simple saying goes, be master of your will, but slave of your conscience, as if conscience was something else beside yourself. And everyone thinks that there is a dialogue between myself and my conscience. Only the human person, says Franco, is able to hear the voice of the conscience as a you. Their transcendent character allows us to understand the most hidden properties practically that are linked to the most intimate personality. It is important to think of the human being as being endowed with this root. The root also makes us think of the unconscious, because the root is not seen, but we understand that it exists. For the religious person, Franco thinks that conscience is the antechamber of a sense that goes beyond the psyche. We must not find conscience in psychism, in the psychic apparatus. We must not try to understand where conscience comes from the superego. No. Because not even the psychic movement of survival, which can explain something of conscience, cannot fully explain it, not even exclude it. I cannot say that because my psychism is led to survive or leads me to survive, I have no moral conscience. And the instinctual drive, and here the criticism that we can make of psychoanalysis is to put in the same intrapsychic dimension the superego and the drive, the instinct. It is as if through self-absorption the person builds their own riverbanks. It's as if I have the potential to do anything to survive, and then I build a superego that limits me. Do you think a river can ever build its own banks? No. Does the river build its own embankment? No. And so it happens with the human person. Conscience should be a different dimension to the psychic dimension. Psychism cannot build conscience. What is conscience then? It is the organ of meaning. Another difficulty we have is to understand that conscience is not God. Some thinkers, some psychoanalysts, thought of conscience as God himself. Instead, the voice of conscience, the dialogue with conscience, makes us think of another instance. God is outside of conscience, and therefore the definition given by the Second Vatican Council on conscience is very adequate for this existential form of understanding it. It is the most secret core or sanctuary of the human person, where he or she is alone with God, but that person is not God. Conscience is the space where the human person is with God, but he or she is not God. Its function, in addition to thinking of it as having an ethical function, as an ability to intuit love in a situation, conscience is like the organ of meaning for Viktor Frankl. It is like the eye that sees the meaning. Conscience speaks in a univocal way, while values, which we can say lie in the sphere of universal meanings, may be in a certain conflict with each other. Conscience looks at these values and puts them in order. It means that conscience is an organ that gives a hierarchy to values, because values by themselves could converge. They could put themselves, we can say, in conflict. Viktor Frankl, despite living in the last century, has a prophetic vision of these times. He sees these times and sees the time of relativism. And he sees that we live in an era where meaning is being increasingly lost. The meaning which we normally find. He says in the Ten Commandments, in the moral code, well, apparently has lost its power for many people. I would say for very many. Now, a person should be ready to accept the 10,000, the millions of commandments contained in the 10,000, 100,000 or million possibilities of response to the different situations which life puts before us. And therefore, the education of conscience becomes something decisive. It is education in freedom, in the capacity for choice, in the vision that can see the values enclosed in all the possibilities that the human person has, and sees responsibility as a response in the best sense. Freedom, responsibility, vision are not improvised, and in this case, the conscience needs to be educated.
Ecco, grazie Roberto Almada, questo penultimo intervento.
Thank you very much for this talk on psychology and existential analysis and the type of psychotherapy inaugurated by Viktor Frankl. Roberto has led us to ask ourselves about the meaning of conscience which has multiple different aspects: love, ethics, art, meaning, and putting these in parallel with the gains made by traditional psychoanalysis of Freud. So, the conscience as a place that can be read from different points of view, different aspects, not only therefore a place where the moral choices or great values are made, but a location for creativity and love and meaning. The great word underlying Viktor Frankl's analysis is meaning. So we'll come back to these subjects also because some of our questions are going in that direction. We've seen a self that was perhaps under the radar in Emanuele, which has brought to the surface in the study of our brain, that acquires different aspects according to the point of view from which we look at it, as we have heard from Roberto Almada. If we look at the point of creativity, ethics, love and meaning. So now we're going to hear a final point of view on the self, on us, on our broader self, arising from Latin American sensitivities and awareness, not only to do with personal choices, but also social choices and influencing the choices of others, and not in a suitable, adequate way, not in a superficial way, but in a way that is deeper, much deeper. And so now I'm going to hand over to Cecilia Di Lasio. She is a professor, doctor of education, specialization in child mediation at the La Salle University in Guatemala and also in Costa Rica. She's got a master's in Church's social doctrine from Casablanca and also philosophy in Salvador. She teaches in matters concerning social development of society. She also teaches in the Latin American Sophia University. She teaches intercultural anthropology in Kenya. She's also professor and researcher for political and social thought in a university in Buenos Aires, with specialisms in teaching and working with the teachers in that university. So I hand over now to Cecilia from the south of the world, freedom and the problem of evil. Greetings, everybody. My name is Cecilia. My talk is Conscience in a Pluralistic World, a view from the global south. So let's start. Martin Buber, a philosopher of the moral component of human relations, tells us the you comes before the self. It is in the network of relationships, of recognition, that we discover the meaning of existence and the possibility of exercising freedom. A Brazilian teacher says, I and you become in the relationships. In the dialectic of relationships, the twos become two we. Social conscious is not a secondary element in a person's life, but, on the contrary, the process of individualization is the result of recognition at an interpersonal, evaluative and collaborative levels. In the contemporary world, there are situations of inequality in relationships and difficulties for many people in accessing essential goods, and there is a lack of recognition of the inalienable rights of entire populations across the planet. On a global scale, there is little sensitivity towards these facts, and our speculative economy makes a strong impact upon these peoples. Indifference in the structures of society, permissive indifference in the structures of society can be called the malaise of civilization. In addition, there is a lack of legal direction to guide towards better models of distribution of goods and participation. The process of colonization in various parts of the world has generated in colonized peoples a conscience that is also colonized. In many people who are incapable of recognizing the structural situations of oppression. This is separation of the ethical conscience from the conditions of development and dignity of every human being. This naturalizes, makes normal the structural evil that causes and sustains personal evil, wrongdoing. This is what is expressed in various church documents as structures of sin, which are produced by personal actions, but operate and sustain conditions of injustice that exceed the personal will of an individual. This is important, that what happens is they confuse what is legal with what is ethically good. This is the case, for example, of speculative financial systems, discriminatory legislation, laws that give privilege to some for the exploitation of nature and production. This is how the Church describes these things in various documents, such as those at Puebla, in the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and Aparecida. Situations of extreme poverty and great social vulnerability disturb the development of the personal dimension of conscience. Many people naturalize, normalize adverse conditions by referring to them as destiny or as the natural division of power, the good fortune of a few, or even divine punishment. At the same time, the consciences of those who have power, who dominate, feel a need to educate citizens by applying punishment or social pressure in the face of apathy, and by resorting to forms of violence in response to what is perceived as moral incapacity or weakness. Let's ask ourselves, how does this narcotic drug, so to speak, work in the moral conscience in so many situations and lead to discrimination regarding basic human rights and access to the basic needs of every human being? We know that the roots of human conscience lie in the sphere of relationships linked to survival. But this has to be amplified and is amplifying enormously towards much broader horizons of meaning. This qualitative leap in the process of community building takes place through language. Homo sapiens gradually becomes Homo communicans when he or she incorporates the other person into their perception of the world and their desires, what they want. This process generates a bond based upon giving that we can call munus, because it is a gift. It is a gift and also a task, a duty intrinsic to the meaning of coexistence. This bond is a reward for sharing. The act of communication generates a shared identity that is freely lived out in our expression of this bond. Thus, the word community expresses not a collection of individuals, but a bond that is freely and reciprocally expressed among people. The formation of conscience begins in openness to emotions that gives access to the universe of life, of the whole of life. There are many reminders of this in the wisdom of human history. In Genesis, for example, when God asks Cain about his brother, the answer tells us of the journey which we as humanity have had to undertake to become aware of ourselves as relational beings. It's up to us as human beings to take on the ethical dimension of care. Cain answers, "Am I my brother's keeper?" The failure of our capacity to respond freely to others makes humanity mature in its understanding of the ethical dimensions of living together, of coexistence, and in the search for the good towards which to direct various types of interest. Many communities in Latin America, even in serious situations of oppression and marginalization, have developed ethical models of coexistence that we call buen vivir, good living. They are social norms of reciprocity that do not develop at a later stage of life as a personal way of being and acting, but on the contrary, are regarded as essential to a personal life and harmony in a diverse community. From community values, concepts such as equilibrium in the community, respect for the environment, appreciation of the elderly, and protection of the vulnerable are incorporated into the economy. This newness in the paradigm of modernity, the newness, the bond of reciprocity that underpins all community life, will be transformed into a contract, a pact between different individuals with opposing views who come together to safeguard their own particular interests. An individualistic conscience will confuse freedom with the protection of their particular rights. Ethical individualism is rooted in the anthropological perception of the individual as existing a priori before social encounter. As a result, the latter, social encounter, will be regarded as conflictual and even violent. Conscience will have to adapt to obedience of the law, shifting the ethics of the communication of meaning to rational submission to duty as a universalized law for all. This is why Igino Giordani, when analyzing the social causes of violence and war, said, "We must rebuild a conscience." In the current technocratic paradigm, human action is identified with the concept of production. It moves from relational factors to productivity. Thus, ethical conscience is assessed by external parameters, by the results expected within a pre-established program. As a result, the demand for rights such as dignified work, housing, meaningful education are conceived as interfering with public order, even when large groups of people may be pressing for them. Our reflection should also acknowledge the generalized acceptance of serious contradictions between wealth and marginalization in many urban groups. Great social differences coexist, which mean patterns that reproduce themselves, marking and highlighting social and economic discrimination. The education of conscience is therefore everyone's responsibility in order to awaken sensitivity to shared values, shared emotions, and consequently to be the guide towards a socio-communal rebuilding. The original relational nature of all reality, and in particular of men and women, is rational, but is also aesthetic and therefore ethical. Showing responsibility in drawing close to or caring for others directs our entire life towards greater freedom and harmony. If the starting point is the social norm, the formation of conscience allows for the rational justification of structures developed in specific cultural contexts and that have to be imposed universally. For example, the notion of private property as a universal right legitimizes the appropriation of land, often originating in initial acts of violence over populations that, without appropriating it, use it to find space in which to live. Moral punishment for non-respect of property doesn't refer to living and working relationships, but to the absolute right of appropriation by certain people or groups. Thus, in this way, we sanction theft, and we allow theft and applaud financial deviousness as a means of growing rich. When moral education is not based on the recognition of the common dignity of all human beings, the social hierarchy in relation to achievements is considered morally valid, without identifying the inequity of origin of the possibilities of action, which is what we call meritocracy. meritocracy. Instead of mercy, the notion of punishment and retribution is attributed first to God and then to the established authorities. This detaches the conscience from our personal responsibility to be neighbors and to be instigators in the front line in granting everyone conditions of greater dignity. The path towards a welcoming and fair society requires us to focus upon the ethical value of our relational nature, on this relationality as an encounter. The parable of the Good Samaritan becoming a neighbor gives an ethical character to community life. Everything is united to everything, Pope Francis says. We are a conversation, Heidegger says, quoting Hölderlin, the poet. Our existence can only be panned out in the first person plural, and always the one with the others and the one of the others. It is there where I understand the ethical and ecological dimension of a new civilization. Thank you for listening. Thank you, everybody. And then we'll see about the questions in order to clarify anything that's not clear.
Grazie anche a Cecilia.
Thank you also to Cecilia. With this last very interesting talk, we conclude the various presentations, but we don't conclude our lesson. In fact, with Cecilia, we took a journey with that voice of the south of the world, asking ourselves some ethical questions on freedom and its aspects, on the choices of conscience and in relationship with others as people structured in different ways and people we deal with. So we conclude once again underlining how important the being relational is. So now, I had already suggested to our speakers and to the participants of the second lesson of the course 2021-2021 to grasp what was the fundamental question in each of these talks that have been presented today. I suggest 4 questions that I think they're not the only ones, of course, but for the take off from what's been said, it can lead all those who are listening to continue this reflection and to try to be interested more and more on their own, or by asking our own speakers at another time. So the questions would be these. With Emanuele Pili, we asked ourselves, after all, what is freedom? Emanuele presented to us through the thought of 2 great in the Western culture, Spinoza and Weisnitz. Then with Catherine Belzong, the question that could emerge from her talk is this: is it I operating, moving freely, or is it my brain that makes me act the way I do? Or we could even ask other questions on this. That is, what is the I? Or even more deeply, what is the relationship that I have with my biological corporeal component? Then with the talk of Roberto Almada, we really looked at, placed in the open various aspects of conscience. So, which are these dimensions or characteristics of conscience? Finally, Cecilia brings the question, what happens when the freedom of some interferes or interacts with the freedom of others? So, these are just some questions to continue this reflection that each one can make. But we've also received some questions in the chat or the emails for our four speakers. So I would start immediately from Emanuele. There's quite a number of questions have been asked, not directly to you, but in general. I would sum them up in this way. Various questions have been asked on the terminology that has been used, that is freedom of will. Wouldn't it be best to use the term of free will rather than freedom? And what are the characteristics of freedom? The freedom of conscience. Free will are the same things. Are we talking about the same things? And then there are other questions asked, that is, are we obliged to always choose what is good? Are we really free we should see what the good is to be able to answer that as well, I suppose. Then there is a reference to another book that is the book of Romano Guardini, a great philosopher. He speaks about gathering within yourself as a great area of conscience. So even the title of our course is the place where the human being is alone with God. How can I reach this place of solitude and of being close to God, as Guardini says, in this time and place rather chaotic, where it's not easy to have this silence. So, Emanuele, freedom of will, conscience, the space of conscience. As we choose this space, are we always obliged, forced to choose the good? Questions, a million. Yes. These last questions of Tommaso, I hadn't received them myself, so I'll try to say something as it comes, without really reflecting so much, but I will reflect together with you. After all, I spoke of freedom in two ways, trying to show how they really, one calls for the other. Freedom of will need to be going hand in hand, and then freedom is the place where you fulfill your choices. It's clear that in this sense, the term acquires two different nuances. I didn't have the time to enter in all the details of this distinction that exists. But I would say that things are really interconnected. One calls for the other. What else can I say? Tommaso, you said, what was the question that you posed? Yes, make a clarity of terms. How can we enter into this space of conscience in these really chaotic times? Well, to answer all the other questions, I will use a question myself that I have received, that is probably the most difficult one, and that sort of encompasses all. When there is no reciprocity in relationship, how can we experience freedom? This is the question I've been asked. And this is a very nice challenge. I think that the dimension of rationality, of being relational, in relation, more than in my talk, because it was not easy to follow, because I put it down as a question, is it really there where we make an experience of freedom? But I think that from what has surfaced from the other talks, the dimension of being in relation has its own originality. It's a space which is very original, in which we move, so that, I have to say, we can pretend that that's not the case, and then we say, we can fall into a series of problems. But because since it is true, then in one way or another, it's also true that reciprocity with the other person is never lacking, it's never missing. But what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example, because I've got Francisco in front of me now. I can give him any gift, and Francisco can respond in many ways, can give back to me the gift as I gave it to him, a perfectly symmetric exchange. It never happens like this, really. He gives me something less because maybe I was expecting something a little bit more generous, and instead I receive something that's worth less. We maintain the reciprocity, but a little less than I was expecting, or else it could be more. It's always the case with Francisco. Whatever he gives me is over and above what I expected. But let's place it in the worst situation. He just walks off and he doesn't give a damn about the gift I've given him. In this case, I would say we have the situation that was hinted at in the question, when the reciprocity of the other is the absence of the other, and therefore the other doesn't offer me his presence, but reciprocates with his absence, his or hers not being there. This experience recalls that dimension that I was mentioning at the end of the talk, that third dimension that opens up in relationships when there is a rapport of love. Since it's true that a rapport is there all the time, that in some way there is always reciprocity, then this third dimension also in some way must always be there too. I believe that freedom remains an experience of reciprocity, but in that case, in that case that it's limit point, the reciprocity I must discover is the reciprocity with the absence of the other, with that lack of response from the other. It's a reciprocity that's complex, difficult, and someone asks me, how can I live it? Well, it requires the whole of our lifetime to understand that, but it also forces me to go into a deeper experience. Of those who have more experience in life can be a more free person because has discovered this reciprocity. This type of reciprocity is the fruit the most profound experience of freedom. But it's not easy to live. And I add, if it's true that you comes before the I, then I can't think of it as being originary, that gives origin to the whole thing. We experience that the fullness originally in a relationship of love. It is there that freedom really lights up. It cannot be born just from the gift of the other. That means that the gift of the other comes later. What comes to my mind now is that if I were to speak about the spirituality of unity, I would say that the discovery that God loves me immensely comes first, comes before the discovery of Jesus forsaken. Therefore, this is very, very important for us, because we truly can build otherwise hell if we don't have that as it's at our basis. We need to have clear that the basis of it all, the discovery that God is love, comes first. And I guess that in the mystical writings of Chiara, after all, even hell lives unity in some way, because the original relationship exists. The problem is that it's not a unity of love. Therefore, at times, this makes us very responsible. If we don't have that form of unity, we build hell. But the paradoxes of life tells us that then, because we are human beings, failures as human beings, our freedom grows, finds also huge depth, even within the experience of hell. Have I answered your question? I don't think so. But I might have given you a way of thinking, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you. I believe
un'altra porta del pensiero molto grande, toccando
You've
anche
opened up quite a
la
big
spiritualità.
picture for us,
Bene,
looking at
continuiamo con le
spirituality.
nostre-
So
con le
let's
nostre
carry on
domande.
with
Il
our
tempo
questions.
non ci aiuta,
And we're
quindi
not being
chiedo
very
ai
much
nostri
helped
relatori di
by
essere
time.
sintetici,
So I would
anche se
ask our speakers
effettivamente
to
è molto
be
complesso,
brief, even though
essere
obviously
sintetici,
it's
ma
quite a
forse
complex,
dare degli
difficult thing, but
spunti
just to give a few
di riflessione a
pointers
chi
for
fa
reflection to
appunto le domande.
those who are asking the
Gruppo di
questions. And the
domande
second
è
group of
piuttosto robusto, è
questions
per
is
Catherine
quite
Belzong
a number of these is for
e riguarda un
Catherine,
po'
and
tutte il rapporto tra il
it's
cervello
about the
e
relationship
l'io.
between the brain
Cioè,
and the self.
che cos'è l'io?
What
Chi
is
è
the self? Who
l'io?
is the
E qual è il
self?
suo rapporto con il cervello?
The ego,
Quali
and
sono gli
what is the
influssi
relationship with
esterni
the
sul
brain? What are the
cervello? E poi
external influences
ancora
on the brain?
ci sono delle esperienze
Are there
osservate,
any
osservabili che le
experiences that have
neuroscienze
been
fanno sulla
observed
vita
in
della spiritualità, vita di
neuroscience
preghiera, di
on
meditazione?
prayer, spirituality,
Ecco,
meditation?
Catherine, a te la
Over to
parola.
you, Catherine.
E il microfono, eccoci.
Here we are.
Mi sente?
Can you hear me?
Sì, benissimo.
Sì, grazie per queste
Thank you
domande
for
molto
these questions, which are
interessanti.
very
Vanno in due
interesting. They
direzioni.
go in two
Comincio con quella
directions. I'll
sull'io,
start with the one about
poi
the
farò quella
self, the
la
ego,
spiritualità,
and then we'll move
eccetera.
on to the brain and
Quella
spirituality.
sull'io,
The
per
one about the
rispondere a questa
self, to
domanda,
answer this
si dovrebbe
question,
primo
we should
sapere cosa è l'io.
first of all know what
Allora, nelle
who is the
neuroscienze
self.
ci sono
In
poche riflessioni
neuroscience,
su
there's
cosa è
little
l'io.
reflection
In
on the
generale
self, the
si intende
ego.
l'io come
Generally, it's
una
considered
cosa che è
as
basata
something founded
la
on
coscienza
an
autobiografica.
autobiographical
Dire?
conscience. What do I
Per
mean
esempio,
by
se
this?
prendo il mio
If I
esempio,
think of my own
io
example,
posso
I can
ricordarmi
remember
di eventi che sono
myself, remind
successi quando avevo
myself
3
of events when I
o
was
quando
3,
ero adolescente
or when I was
o
an
quando
adolescent,
avevo 30
or when I was 30.
e io so
And
che
I know
nonostante il fatto
that
che
despite
la persona di 3
the fact
anni,
that this
quella
person who was
adolescente
3
sono molto
or an
diverse,
adolescent,
anche
they were very
se si
different.
guardano
If you
le
look
fotografie
at the
si vede
photographs, you
molto bene
see
che
very
non è la
clearly
stessa
that it's not the
apparenza,
same
ma
appearance.
nonostante questi
But
cambiamenti
despite these
si sa che
changes,
c'è una
we know that there is
permanenza,
something
cioè si
permanent
sa che
there.
nonostante
We know that
il fatto che
despite
le cose
the
sono
fact that
variabili,
there are many
c'è sempre
variables, many things changing,
una identità
there is a
stabile, cioè quello
stable
che
identity,
potrei chiamare
what
l'io.
I could call the
Allora,
self,
adesso la domanda era
the
la
ego.
relazione tra
So
questo
then the
io
relationship between
e
this
il
self
cervello.
and the brain.
Nella mia opinione,
In
allora
my
lì ci sono molte
opinion, there are many
teorie,
theories.
hanno parlato vari
People,
scienziati,
different scientists have
per
spoken
esempio
on this.
Jean-Pierre Changeux, lui ha detto che
Jean-Pierre
veramente l'io si può
Changeux said
ridurre al
that the
cervello.
self can be reduced to the
O
brain.
altri come Damasio sono entrati
Damasios
più
went
sfumature,
into
hanno
more
fatto la
nuances
distinzione
and made a
tra vari
distinction
livelli
between different
dell'io.
levels of the self,
Secondo il livello c'è il legame
and
col cervello
according
sarebbe
to the
diverso.
different level, you have a
Per
different
me,
bond with the brain.
il modo nel quale lo
The
vedo,
way I see it,
io penso
I
che il
believe
cervello
that the
è
brain is a necessary condition for the self, but not a sufficient condition. If now I don't have any brain at all, I won't have this self that is able to perceive myself as a person who is me at 3 or 14. So the brain is necessary but not sufficient. You can't reduce the self to the brain precisely because the brain is insufficient. This is the first question, just being rather brief because there's much time. The second question, concerning whether there are experiments on what happens in the brain when somebody has a spiritual experience. There is much research on this that have been done, above all, on people of different religions. The Dalai Lama allowed his brain to be tested, and doing meditation experiments were done on Carmelite sisters while they had the experience of being in a relationship with God. So the many experiments have been done. They show things really that are quite basic. They show that when someone is praying, that there is activation of parts of the brain focusing on attention because people concentrate. Or the Carmelites sisters, when they had an experience of union with God, there's activation of the pleasure part of the brain was activated. At the same time, this says something about what's going on in the brain, but it doesn't allow one to comprehend the richness of this experience. It just allows you to touch on a part of the experience, but you can't reduce an experience or prayer to the attention being given by the brain or union with God just to the pleasure part of the brain. It's a part of this, but it's insufficient to explain these things.
Molto interessanti questi contributi.
Thank you. Very interesting. All this, certainly there is a lot of literature for anyone who wants to go deeper, and this research has a lot that's been written, and it's fairly easy reading too. You can easily find it in bookshops. So, for Roberto Almada, two questions. The first one is just to clarify on this, the dimension of the unconscious and the relationship with conscience in Franco. And the second, it's rather very straight, the question, what educates conscience if conscience is to be educated? Thank you for these questions. The first. After all, if I knew why I love someone, Viktor Frankl says, I wouldn't love him. In this sense, in this position, we need to find all the Hebrew position where the name of God is not to be pronounced. We don't know. It's also something that is. I always make the simple example. If I take the car to the garage and they start fixing it all up, but if I want to test the car, I need to close the bonnet and move. I can't keep it up. So what happens when conscience sees the goodness of something or of a person and loves? We don't know exactly what's happening because it's a dynamic that takes the person outside. We see more than anything the consequences. We see the signs. And now, a little bit following what Catherine was saying, certainly a person who uses substances could have visions very beautiful, like a Carmelite nun, if you like, in a sense. But the difference is in the history. of the person that has these experiences, psychedelic or the Carmelite that is from an ascetic way of life. And you can see that scientifically. For, who knows who loves and who doesn't love? And Franco is against voluntaristic. Why do we have to love everybody? Yes. But why? Because the morality says that we should love everyone. No. When I meet with people. I moved when I'm with a particular person and I cannot explain. And these are the dynamics of love, not from a necessity to do so. The other question, who forms our conscience? Well, all the colleagues that spoke to us speak about rationality, how things are in relation, and that person who had a brain of a psychopath, and yet the empathy he had was from the love he received from his parents. So it is love that makes us grow in conscience. But it's not that we grow in conscience. We grow in freedom. We grow in an ability to give an answer to a particular situation. We grow in all these dynamics that place me in real life situations. Therefore, I think that I wouldn't be able to say who educates the conscience, but I could say something about how that happens. And for sure, being very close to a person, the ability to say to this person that you are unique, that you are irrepeatable, unique, beautiful. And this is really educating the conscience, not forcing it towards the good, but you're giving a stimulus, correcting that, saying that some things might not be for its own good. But these relationships of closeness really educate the conscience, these elements of being close and recognize the person, the beauty of the other person. And educating conscience is not to educate in some content of what is good and what is bad, but to educate in anguish, to be responsible, that you're unique, irreplaceable, and whatever you do is irreplaceable and unique for that moment. So educating conscience is to help the person to stay on their own feet, in living their own life. Thank you, Roberto.
So we'll finish now with a question to Cecilia. I don't know whether she will respond in Italian. No, she won't. She's going to speak in Spanish. We'll see whether there's a possibility of a translation, if the regia says no or yes. Otherwise, I'll do it. I hope there will be from the regia. So here's the question for Cecilia. The different approaches presented this afternoon, aren't they models of culture so as to affirm an individual in historical cultural situation? What is the role of cultures in the definition of conscience and its formation?
Hablo en castellano, me disculpan, pero es que no solamente la emoción, sino la necesidad de construir
It's not only emotions.
para ser lo más clara posible. Es interesantísima la pregunta. Creo que tenemos que decir que hoy estamos y vivimos en universos culturales muy diferentes, y el esfuerzo o el aporte que he tratado de hacer supone, diría yo, un cuestionamiento, una deconstrucción de ciertas certezas éticas, como las que nos hacen suponer que existe una cultura moral universal que ha nacido.
I'm sorry, we don't seem to have the Spanish translation coming through in our headphones here.
Constatamos que conviven situaciones de extrema violencia institucionalizada. Entonces, me parece que es muy interesante la pregunta que también en el chat alguno decía justamente en relación a esta violencia enmascarada, digamos, ¿no? Creo que tenemos que diferenciar porque también lo decía, ¿no es cierto? La definición de la conciencia con la formación de la
The
conciencia.
definition of conscience with the formation of conscience.
Es así como han dicho.
The definition of conscience that they said to us is fantastic. It's what other people said, and there is a very deep dimension seeking meaning and looking at our relational way of being that I allow myself to say, to dialogue. There's a dynamism that arises from my encounter with the other that goes into further depth in my encounter with the other, the formation of conscience, as was said before. The formation of conscience often isn't about, so it's possible to affirm universally or to impose logic of actions that maintain situations of violence and oppression. The question that was asked, there is violence here. It's masked violence, it's masked by the legal system. So when we talk about conscience, we can't stay suspended, as it were, protected. We can't just stay at ease what is considered to be socially good and acceptable, because these legal law-binding society, much is the hand of self-interest is behind those who establish the law and who have the power to make the laws. So for us, the fundamental experience of ethics to put empathy, as we said before, to put empathy, culture, and dialogue as essential, existential qualities of human beings, put these into community, people in community, put all of these certainties that we have of what is good and what is not good, so as to walk forward at these levels of meaning, as we were saying, with a greater dimension of our moral conscience, of our awareness of belonging to a universe that allows life, that safeguards life, the whole of life. We can't consider that it's ethically good to remain at ease, our consciences at ease, when those what we call good, or what we say is legally good, legally right, actually supports structures in which there are many parts of humanity that are of a great, massively limited. This is not, they don't have the freedom, the right to life, the right to dignity. So this is why I think that it's a massive responsibility that puts us on the journey towards a greater unity, a greater quality in our relationships, also within the movement, in responsibility to deepen and revise this our social society in favor of life, in order to truly reach a united world. Thank you, Roberto, Emanuele Pili, all of you who have followed this second lesson of our UPM course, the Popular Marian University of the Focolare Movement this year. The title is The Place Where a Person is Alone with God, Their Conscience. So you find these on online and in streaming in different languages. I draw your attention to the next meeting, the 22nd of January 2022, the biblical covenant and discipleship aspect of conscience, and we'll look at scripture and conscience. So have a good evening and a happy Christmas, everybody, and we'll see one another on the 22nd of January.